So I'm going to go ahead and officially kick us off here. Good evening. My name is Jonathan Stewart. I'm a member of the Shenandoah Group of the Sierra Club Executive Committee. On behalf of the Shenandoah Group of the Sierra Club and the Climate Action Alliance of the Valley, I want to thank you all for joining us this evening. If you're interested in connecting with our local Sierra Club group or looking for ways to get more involved in general, please don't hesitate to reach out to us via email at sc.shen.group@gmail.com. You can also connect with us on our Facebook page. And I'd also encourage you to connect with Climate Action Alliance of the Valley on their Facebook page and website. And I'm going to go ahead and just toss those into the chat here so you all have them if you want them. There's all that info. Heads up that our next free virtual event is going to take place in early July. So we're still nailing down a time, but a specific time and date, but we're going to be discussing urban forestry with Dr. Michaela Schmidt-Harsh. Dr. Schmidt-Harsh is an assistant professor at JMU and affiliate at the Bloomington Urban Forestry Research Group at Indiana University, and is also a member of the City of Harrisonburg's Land Use and Green Space Committee. So that should be a really good event. Once we have the date locked in, we'll get that posted to our Facebook page. So keep an eye out for that in early July. But tonight, we are thrilled to welcome Dr. Maria Bowman, and we're going to be talking about native plants. Dr. Bowman grew up in Verona, Virginia, and currently lives in Poolesville, Maryland, with her husband, dog, and cat. In addition to her passion for native plants and exploring the natural world, Maria holds a PhD in agricultural economics from the University of California, Berkeley, a master's degree in forestry from Virginia Tech, and a bachelor's in science and environmental science from Juniata College in Pennsylvania. She has worked in nonprofits, the agricultural industry, and government, and has lived and worked in Ecuador, Brazil, and Mozambique. So Dr. Bowman, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We're really excited to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Jonathan. Really glad to be here. So you heard from Jonathan that my day job is not really about native plants, and my doctorate is not in native plants. Native plants are my hobby, but I do spend quite a lot of time thinking about them, digging in the dirt, experimenting with them, and figuring out what has worked and has not worked on our little property in Maryland. So really excited to be here and talk with you about my experience with native plants. And I think we have a small enough group that people can just drop questions in the chat or interrupt me if something's not clear. I don't always do such a great job of monitoring the chat while I'm talking, but I'll do my best. Jonathan, if there's stuff coming in that you think I can answer while I'm talking and I'm not seeing it, feel free to interrupt me as well.
Sounds good.
So let's see here. Okay, can you see my screen now?
Yep, we've got it.
Okay. So this is my property in Poolesville, Maryland, and what I'm going to talk about tonight is a little bit about my experience transforming our property from something that had very few native plants and quite a lot of invasive species to something that looks quite different today. And I'm also going to tell you a little bit about my experience advocating for native plants in our community and in public spaces, and some of the lessons that I've learned that hopefully will help you if you're just getting started with natives or thinking about adding more to your home garden or landscape. So I've got two questions on this slide, and hopefully the first one I'll be able to answer some pieces of this evening. Why natives? Why are they a good thing to add to your landscape? What are some of the reasons you might consider adding them? And then the other one is, what are your goals? And I think this is a really important question for you to ask yourselves as you're listening to this presentation. Is your goal just to learn more about native plants and their importance, or bring them to parks? Maybe you live in an apartment and you don't have a lot of space. Do you want to bring more wildlife into your yard? Or maybe you have resource concerns or tough areas or soil that you're trying to deal with, poor drainage. You might have areas where you have water ponding, or you're thinking about a rain garden. Maybe you have a traditional landscape and you're okay with that, but you want to incorporate some well-behaved natives that are attractive and that you can add to flower bouquets. I am not going to judge you whatever your goals are here this evening. I'm not a purist about natives, although my family might say otherwise when I give them a hard time about planting non-natives. I'm going to do my best to not do that to you. And as I get started, I also want to mention to you a couple of really good resources. If you're not familiar with Doug Tallamy, he's one of the foremost experts on native plants, and he also writes really good books on natives. So 2 of his books are called Bringing Nature Home and Nature's Best Hope. They are both available on Amazon, and they're really good introductions to this question of why natives, why does bringing them into your landscape and into the ecosystem matter from the big picture perspective in terms of pollinator health, ecosystem health, and all of those things. He also has a really cool website and nonprofit that he has founded called homegrownnationalpark.org. And it is bringing, basically bringing people to that website to catalog all of the places where native plants are getting planted on their own. Let's see if I can see the chat at the same time. On their own properties. So yeah, a lot of really good stuff coming out of Doug Tallamy. So on this slide, I wanted to share with you 2 screenshots from Google Street View of our property. The first one is before we moved in, probably pretty similar to what it looked like when we bought it in 2016. Basically, you could not see our house from any direction. We had a park on 2 sides. You couldn't see it from either side of the park. You couldn't see it from the front, and you couldn't see it from the side. And in some ways that was really, really attractive to us when we purchased this property because we are, we like our privacy, we like trees. So, that we liked that feeling of having a lot of greenery in our space and not just having it be lawn. But at the same time, it didn't take too long after we moved in for me to discover that a lot of the plants that were there were things I really did not want. A lot of tree species we weren't interested in. There wasn't a lot of sunlight getting in. We had a really big tiger mosquito problem. They were breeding everywhere in our gutters and our downspouts. So we pretty quickly figured out we needed to remove some plants, especially as we started to identify them. So you can see I have a nice list there of some of the most feared invasives that people deal with. We also had some good species, so I didn't want to leave those out. We had a mature redbud that we did eventually cut down, but we got a lot of seedlings out of. So we took our mature redbud and turned it into probably 10 different redbud trees that are now all about our property. We had a mature river birch in the front yard. Trying to think we had a couple of black cherries and a little locust grove in the back of the property, all of which are really good nectar sources, early season nectar sources for pollinators, and river birches are really popular with insects and birds. So some good stuff. And then the bad stuff, we had bush honeysuckle, which you might be familiar with. It's a pretty common invasive in landscapes in the mid-Atlantic. It has those red berries and the honeysuckle-like flowers, but it's more of a shrub. And it takes over. Birds will eat the berries. It self-seeds really readily. And it thrives in dry shade, which not a lot of plants do. Winter creeper, it has a pretty similar habit to English ivy. It creeps along the ground and it thrives in the wintertime. So late winter to early spring is when you'll see it start coming out and going all over the place. Really a nasty one. Garlic mustard, you may or may not be familiar with that one, but it's
I think you just froze up on us, Maria.
Am I unfrozen yet?
You are now, yep.
Okay. Let's see. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, good to go.
All right. So garlic mustard is a nasty one. It self-seeds so readily that when you pull it out, people encourage you to put it in a black plastic trash bag and put it in the trash so you're not disseminating it. Like, don't put it in the back of your truck and drive it around. Like, I've pulled it out of the ground and left it on the ground and it still flowers and seeds even though it's been pulled up. So it's really, really hardy plant. You can also eat it, but you probably can't eat it in the quantities to take care of it if you have a garlic mustard problem on your property. White mulberries, this was another big problem that we had, primarily because they were really, really big. They were, 50 to 75 years old, and they were blocking out all sunlight. So they were out competing lots of other opportunities for flowers and shrubs and native plants. And Oriental bittersweet had formed like a giant wall at the back part of our property. It was killing trees. It was just impossible. And each of these we're continuing to fight them, but it's getting better every year, basically. Like, so some of these I'm not seeing much of anymore, but I'm still seeing mulberry seedlings coming up. I still am pulling bittersweet every now and again. The honeysuckle we have pretty much under control. The winter creeper, our neighbor has winter creeper on his property, and the birds are eating the berries, and so I still am seeing them coming up all the time. So this is going to be like one of my themes in this presentation is patience. You've got to be patient when you're changing your landscape and adding natives, and you also have to be patient with fighting invasive species. And again, I said I wasn't going to be judgmental. Sometimes, depending on the size of your property, the best way to fight invasive species is with herbicides and selective use of herbicides. It's not possible always to control these things mechanically. So that's just something to keep in mind. We did do all of this sort of by hand, like we dug up the honeysuckle bushes and did a lot of removal ourselves, but that's just not always possible. You can see that there's a lot of materials online. If this is a problem that you have, if it's not one species, it's going to be another species. And as long as you can identify the species, you'll be able to find some resources online for figuring out how to control it. So the Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation has a natural heritage website where they have a list of invasive species with some facts about all of those. There's also a really nice resource called Mistaken Identity: Invasive Plants and Their Native Lookalikes, which helps you think about how to identify them if you're not sure about whether it's a good or a bad plant. And invasive.org is another one that's a sort of a consortium of universities and government agencies that are putting together resources for fighting invasive plants. So gotta start somewhere, and sometimes it's getting rid of the bad stuff that's there. So moving on to bringing the good back into the landscape. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on landscape design because it's not my forte. If you ask my husband, it's definitely not my forte. I just plant stuff. Sometimes I plan, sometimes I move it around later. I'm a little impulsive when it comes to adding plants, but I do pay attention, in particular when I'm walking around in planned gardens. This is an example of one that I really like. It's in DC, right near the Smithsonian, and I was there this week and I was like, oh, I'll get a picture of this because the penstemons are looking really nice. So there are a lot of botanical gardens that focus on native plants. A lot of the ones in DC have transitioned in that direction. I also look at a lot of photos online, and like I said, I plant things and I move them around if they don't work. So this is, this wasn't particularly planned, but this was where we wound up introducing more native species on our property. And basically we just kind of stuck with the borders of things that were already there. So you can see that there's a big bed of natives right along the main road, which probably much to the chagrin of people during the winter when I leave everything standing and dead so that things have a place to live. There's some sort of sparse natives over on the left-hand side there bordering with the park. And then in the backyard, we have a fence. So a lot of what I did in the last couple years after we added the fence was plant along the fence to have some beds there with a lot of tall standing natives. Beds along the house, and we have a lot of really different conditions. So in the front yard, we have pine trees and cedars for the most part along those front borders of the property. And so I have a lot of dry shade that I have to deal with, which can be really, really challenging. So you'll see a lot of plants that thrive in dry shade. Also have some wet spots and some really shady and wet spots. And then moderate sun in the back part of the property, and then back there near the vegetable garden, some pretty good sun. So varied conditions, mostly sort of a clay soil here in Poolesville too. So not always great drainage, but we have a little bit of a slope, so it usually drains pretty well. I have added more than 100 species of native trees, shrubs, and perennials. I was trying to list them out today and count them. I didn't get an exact count, but a lot. And I would say that if I think about my ongoing goals for my landscape, it's mostly to add filler plants so I don't have to do so much weeding and maintenance. So you'll see that there are a lot of beds on the property, and then the last couple years, I've just been spending tons of time weeding and trying to make sure that I'm fighting that battle against, especially the winter annual weeds and some of the stuff that just continues to come back. I mentioned continual removal of invasive species, and then moving or thinning plants that are either spreading or don't work where they are. So I give away a lot of plants, which is sometimes good and sometimes bad. But people know to throw them out if they can't use them anymore. So some of my favorite plants, I put this in here early. Obviously, we can talk some more in the discussion about particular plants or things that people really like. I mentioned dry shade was one of my challenges. So some of my favorite plants for dry shade are downy skullcap, hairy penstemon, and sweet scented Joe Pyeweed, which is a Joe Pyeweed that thrives in the shade. It's also a spectacular pollinator plant, particularly for swallowtail butterflies. So I like to tell the story of going for a walk around town during Joe Pyeweed season, and wandering around. I saw a couple swallowtails here and there, and then I came back to the house and there was like 50 swallowtails just everywhere. It was like it was so beautiful, and that's one of the reasons that I grow native plants is primarily to attract insects because I really like them. It's, just is what it is. So you're going to see a lot of photos of insects in my presentation. Lyreleaf Sage is another one that thrives in dry shade and actually is really easy to grow from seed. So that's whenever I can find large quantities of seed of that one, I will just toss it out on bare soil and kind of let it go. Foam flower is that last one there. That's a really, really great one. It's a lot like coral bells, so it has that kind of traditional landscape appeal, and it's an early spring bloomer that also thrives in dry shade. Trees, shrubs, and vines, some typical usual suspects there. One that I've really liked the last couple years that's been a particular favorite is shrubby St. John's wort. It's almost evergreen. It has kind of an evergreen feel to it, and it has really beautiful yellow flowers that bumblebees really like. And then over there in the pollinator magnet category, if you've done any growing of native plants, you've probably come across mountain mints. So that's a category of several different kinds of native mint species that are just spectacular attractants for especially wasps and bees. So when my mountain mints are in bloom, you can go out and you can just see wasps like you've never seen before, with beautiful colors, blue and silver, black and white. Common milkweed, when it blooms, attracts all kinds of pollinators. So in addition to being a host plant for monarchs, the flowers are also really incredible attractants for other pollinators. Hyssops, so anise hyssop, blue giant hyssop, yellow giant hyssop are all really incredible attractors for pollinators when they're in bloom. And then some of these other ones, goldenrods and asters, you're probably familiar with. Late boneset and blue mistflower, maybe not so much, but they're ones that you would see blooming along the side of the road. Not a super spectacular bloom, but if they're in the landscape and you look at them, you'll always see pollinators on them. Just a couple of photos to break up the text. So on the left, there's a coral honeysuckle vine. I actually wound up moving this one because we took out the fence along our vegetable garden, but this is what coral honeysuckle, the native honeysuckle vine, looks like when it's in full bloom, which is just about now. Actually, I have one on the deck that looks a lot like this. And it's an incredible plant, not just for the blooms, which attract hummingbirds, but also, I'll show you after a little bit, I have a photo of a snowberry clearwing that eats the honeysuckle. So it's really just a spectacular plant, and it also stays evergreen a lot of the year. So it's a really good choice if you're looking for a native vine to add to your landscape. And then on the right, this is just a Penstemon digitalis. That's the same one that I showed you in the garden outside the Smithsonian there. Bumblebees really love the Penstemons, and there are a couple of different varieties. So a couple of tips on managing native plants, and this kind of comes back to your goals again. One of the challenges with managing native plants is that a lot of them get really, really tall, right? So some of these plants will max out at like 5 or 6 or 8 feet tall, which, maybe that's fine. Maybe you want a jungle, but maybe you're trying to incorporate them into a little better managed landscape, or they get annoying when they flop over and they fall on your other plants. So one thing that I've learned over the last couple of years that you can do to manage that is actually give them a haircut at a couple different times during the season. So you can cut them. The rule of thumb that I've heard is around Memorial Day and the 4th of July to cut them by half at each of those instances. And that helps deal with some of the height, and it also encourages them to bloom a little bushier. So a really good strategy for managing floppy natives. I mentioned that one of my goals was to cut back on weeding time, which has been a little overwhelming. And one way to do that is to find filler plants that you can fill in the holes with that aren't going to take over. So in the shade, you can use ferns, sedges. In the sun, maybe there are grasses that you can add that you can fill in some of those holes that reduce the competition from weeds and also save you some time. Another tip that I have, depending on your personality, I'm always throwing seeds out there just to see if something will come up. And so it's been a perpetual problem, me not remembering what I planted, not remembering what I seeded. And so my rule of thumb has been, if you don't know what it is, let it grow until you can identify it. If it starts taking over and it's obviously a weed, you'll figure that out. But it might just take a few more weeks for it to merge for you to figure out whether you leave it or you pull it out. So again, coming back to these questions to consider, do you like neat or well-behaved? Do you want a jungle? I have a friend who is a native plant expert, spends a lot of time on native plants, and her house is a beautiful jungle in the yard. It's absolutely incredible, but if I did that, my husband would kill me, right? Like, just wouldn't be tenable. You also have to consider your growing conditions. How much sun do you have? Moisture, ponding, dry shade, again, such a challenge. And then how much time are you willing to allocate to planting and weeding? Do you need to hire somebody to come in and help you install the plants? Do you need to hire somebody to come in and work on the weeding? And I'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges with working with landscaping companies with respect to maintenance of native plants as I've observed them a little bit here too. So I'm going to move on to where to get natives. This can be a real challenge, especially if you're used to just grabbing some plants at Lowe's in the spring to add to your garden and you're wanting to make the transition to native plants and you don't have a ton of time. This is the other thing, is like there's always sort of the time and money trade-off situation. So I'm going to go through a few of the sources that I've used for native plants and some of the pros and cons as I see them. So seeds. Seeds are obviously the cheapest way to get native plants, but they're also the most delayed gratification way to get native plants. Germination can be really unpredictable. Survival can be spotty. And for some plants, it can take a really long time to get to maturity or for the plant to thrive. Now, that's not true of all plants, right? But for me, it's been a little bit trial and error to figure out which ones are quick and easy to grow from seed and which ones you just really shouldn't bother. So plugs are another really good way to get native plants. So that's like, if you think about those 6 packs of vegetables you would get at a hardware store, it's basically a giant tray of those. So they're typically, 2 to 3 inches deep, and they're usually in a flat of like 30 to 50 plugs. Again, a really low upfront cost, but depending on the plant, it can take a while for it to get to maturity or for the plant to thrive. Plants, obviously you can do quarts and gallons. They'll make the landscape look finished a lot faster, but they're often really, really expensive. And nurseries that carry natives are not always close by, as you're probably aware. And then the last one that I rely heavily on are friends and community. So one great thing about borrowing or taking plants from friends, or figuring out how to have plant exchanges, we have plant swaps here in Poolsville occasionally. Plants are usually well established and well suited to the growing conditions in your region. They're often local ecotypes, which is sort of the seed that's best suited to that particular region. But it can often be a guessing game. Like, no surprise, people who are not native experts they don't always know what the plant is, right? So you might get a plant that somebody tells you is one thing and it's actually another thing. So it's a little bit of, experimentation there when you're swapping plants to try and figure out if you have what you think you have. It can also be challenging to transport, and transplant some of these plants, right? So especially in the middle of the summer, not a really good time to be trying to swap plants and get them established. The best times to plant are early in the spring or in the fall. I really like to plant in the fall. And you can plant native plants, you know, pretty much any time as long as the ground's not frozen. And then it gives them a head start in the spring to get those roots established and make sure that they're getting all that rain early in the spring as they're starting to grow again.
I think maybe you froze up again, Maria, if you can still hear me.
No.
Okay. So Prairie Moon Nursery is an online nursery that's a really great source for seeds. They have some really good plant finders in there where you can select according to your growing conditions, the zone that you're in. The only complaint that I have about that site for sourcing seeds is that it can sometimes be a little hard to figure out whether the plant is native to your specific state or region. You have to really dig into the plant description and look at the maps to figure out if it's native to where you are. But otherwise, a really, really great resource for native seeds. And then if you have a really big property, a good source on the East Coast is Ernst Conservation Seeds, and they'll do mixes or specific seeds, but you usually have to buy in a large volume. So that's one that I would recommend if you're trying to, you know, do an entire meadow or a large chunk of property to return it to a more native state. Plugs, I've listed a few sources here. Again, Prairie Moon Nursery. They're a little bit more expensive source for plugs than these other two. The cool thing about ISIL native plants is that they actually source plugs wholesale from other nurseries. So they pull in from a bunch of different nurseries in the Midwest and on the East Coast. And then they sort of, somehow they have an arrangement where they're able to ship those plugs to home gardeners from the nursery. So it's a really great opportunity to get specific plants. If you're looking for something specific, they have a really great selection, and they also source quartz and larger size plants as well. So not just plugs. It's a really great resource. And then Mid-Atlantic Natives is another one that I've used a lot. They used to be located in Pennsylvania, but they're now Virginia toward the coast. Really affordable source for plugs and bare root plants, and I've had really good luck with them. Best way to figure out whether your nurseries have native plants is to look at the Virginia Native Plant Society website for specific native plant nurseries, or to call them and ask them. And if they don't know, it's usually not a good sign. You probably don't want to go there and get native plants if you call and say, do you have any native plants? And they say, I'm not sure. Another thing that I'll say is if you are getting interested in native plants, you can start educating your nursery, right? Like, I'd really like to see native plants at this nursery. Here are some specific ones that I know work really well in home gardens. I'd like it if you would carry those plants. So I know that some folks are more receptive to that than others, but that's another thing to consider. If you're having trouble finding plants, you can also ask your nursery whether they'd be willing to try and find some specific things for you. So here are some examples of what some of these strategies look like. So I mentioned that I grow things from seed. I do this in a couple of different ways. One is I just toss seeds out in areas where there are bare soil. And sometimes I do that like after my plants go to seed. If I have a particular species that I'd like more of in a certain area of my property, I just cut the seed heads off, and then I'll go shake them out or move them around to see if I can get those plants to establish. And that one's kind of a quick and easy way, low risk, because I'm not spending any money on seed. You know, sometimes I don't get plants and sometimes I do. Winter sowing, this is a slightly more managed way of doing the same thing. So you'll see I've got some milk jugs here that I've put some native seed packets in. These came from Prairie Moon Nursery. And you do this in sort of early to mid-winter. You do it in the winter time because most of these types of seeds, a lot of types of seeds for native plants require cold stratification. That means they need a certain amount of cold time, usually cold, damp time, in order to germinate. So milkweeds would be one example. That's what over here on the right, I think this is a poke milkweed. A lot of those seeds require that period of time. You can also shortcut this a little bit if you keep them in the fridge, or maybe you keep them in something cold and moist in the fridge. I've had pretty good luck tossing seed out that's been in the fridge, and for some seeds that'll work as sort of a cold stratification process as well. But a little bit of trial and error involved with growing from seed. Understanding those germination codes is really important. So I mentioned that a lot of them need to cold stratify. So usually that'll be a C germination code. And then in parentheses, it'll tell you how many days it needs to cold stratify. So there'll be like a C30 or a C60. And websites, you can go to, like on the Prairie Moon website, they explain their germination codes, and they also explain them on the seed packets when you order them. So most companies are really helpful about explaining those. One of the cool things about seeds is sometimes you'll toss seeds out and you'll think it was a fail, and then 2 years later the plant will come up, right? So native plants were not always designed to be sort of quick turnarounds, right? They might have an ecological strategy that involves germination over 2 or 3 or 4 years. And so that can be really fun, right? You'll purchase a seed, you'll throw it out, you think it was a fail, and 4 years later you have the plant that you wanted originally. But not always a great strategy if you want a fully mature landscape with that particular plant in it. And then label unless you like surprises. This comes back to the other issue that I mentioned around forgetting what you plant, where, and what it is. Same thing is a problem with seeds, especially when stuff's small. It can be really, really difficult to identify. This is what a plug looks like. So this maybe is little blue stem, or I think this is probably little blue stem grass. I told you where you can get plugs. I didn't really tell you what I thought were good choices for plugs. Grasses are something that's actually a really good choice for plugs, especially if you get them in the fall. It's easy to get them in pretty quickly. Really bad choices for plugs, in my opinion, would be slow growing shrubs. So I had kind of a funny story. My friend at USCA, she's always doing plug sales and sourcing plugs. And we had both gotten some New Jersey tea plugs, which is a beautiful shrub. And we planted them. I think, they were probably a couple inches tall. The next year, the shrub was maybe 4 inches tall. I think my New Jersey tea now is like maybe a foot tall. So that's like maybe 4 years later. It's not the best choice for some of those slow growing shrubs, but there are other shrubs where it is a decent choice. So you just need to maybe do a little research before you purchase plugs, and you're hoping to get mature shrubs out of them. I didn't mention bare root trees and shrubs. I have had really good luck in some cases purchasing bare root trees and shrubs, but again, it's kind of hit or miss depending on the source and the plant, how well it gets established and how fast it grows. Other good choices for plugs would be some of the typical native perennials like asters and goldenrods, and some of the things that it will fill out quickly within a season, right? Coreopsis, a lot of those plants will grow to maturity pretty quickly. I bought my Joe Pyeweed, that shade Joe Pyeweed, I planted it, I think early in the spring, and it bloomed that same season, right? So really good choices for plugs. And then probably obvious, but if you're going to buy a flat of 50 plugs, remember that it takes time to plant them, or find some friends to share them with, because I've definitely been in situations where I've ordered 3 flats of things. They're sitting on my porch or in my yard for a month or 2, and then I forget to water them, and then I lose half of them. So make sure you have a plan for your plugs when they show up, and don't forget to water them. I want to do a quick little bit of education on native cultivars. So this is an area of conflict among native plant enthusiasts, but let me tell you about what a native cultivar is, and then I'll tell you, in my opinion, like what some of the strengths and weaknesses are. So a native cultivar, you're probably familiar with plant naming. So you would have a genus name, a species name, and then that would typically be followed by a cultivar name there in sort of single quotes. So I've given an example here, but that's how you know it's a cultivar, is it has that third name associated with it. And they're basically selections of native plants that have some kind of a different quality that they've either been bred for, or they've been genetically engineered for, or they were selected from the wild, or through some method of chance or strategy, they have an attribute that led them to development as a cultivar and for use in home gardens. A really great resource if you want to learn about native cultivars is the Mount Cuba Center in Delaware. So they do a lot of trials on different nativars, and they're looking at things like, do pollinators still visit them compared to their to the regular species, right? Why, you know, how well do they do during drought compared to the regular species? So some of the concerns about nativars have been these types of things, like maybe they alter pollinator feeding patterns, maybe they don't have that same ecological value in the landscape. And from what I've seen, the answer depends on the plant. So some of them really do have that same ecosystem function, others of them do not. So one example would be things that have been bred or for some reason have double blooms. Those have in a lot of cases been found to actually not be as appealing to pollinators. They're kind of confusing. So again, it kind of depends. I do incorporate some of these into my landscape, and for a couple of reasons. One is when I can't find the straight species. So one example of this would be Coreopsis verticillata. I just haven't been able to find the straight species, but I really like it. So I bought a flat of one of the cultivars, and you know, I don't know what impact that's having on pollinators, but I think as long as you're not populating your entire landscape with native cultivars, it might not be a huge problem. But I guess my word of wisdom would be look for the straight species, and if you can find it, incorporate it. If there's some reason that you don't want the straight species, like maybe it's too big, or maybe it has a disease problem that you're aware of that they've dealt with in the cultivar, then that's another reason to use a nativar, right? Like there's some of them that have been bred to be smaller, right? So if it's a plant that you would never use in your landscape, but you know it has a really high pollinator value and you can get it at half size, that's another great reason to use a cultivar, right? There are small Joe Pye weeds. Some people won't grow Joe Pye weed because sometimes they get 6 or 8 feet tall. So there are dwarf versions, and they still attract pollinators, and I think that's a pretty decent reason to use these as well. I'm going to try and go through these kind of quick so we can leave some time for questions, but I mentioned that insects are one of the reasons that I plant natives. So we got a Marnock over there on the left. We have a unicorn caterpillar in the middle, and we have a snowberry clearwing over there on the right, which is the caterpillar that turns into the hummingbird moth. So that's one of my favorite insects that I like to see. And I've found that actually it's easier to find resources to identify native plants than caterpillars. So I've put down here a resource that I've purchased to help me with this process, because this is one of my favorite things, like finding things eating my plants. I know that sounds weird. A few other recent visitors. So that one over the left is actually a variegated Fertility chrysalis, and their host plant is violets. We have tons of violets in our yard. That's one that, you know, a lot of people would consider a weed in their yard, but again, a really good host plant for fertility butterflies. Some other exciting ones here. Spiders. And then all of these things feed the food web, right? So we have some resident garter snakes. Apparently they like to eat our resident toads in our yard. Sometimes you find those things happening and you're very surprised. And downy woodpeckers are a pretty common visitor in our yard as well, feeding on a lot of the insects and stuff in the trees. So if you're into cut flowers, I know they're not traditionally things that people bring into the house as cut flowers, but I really enjoy working with natives in cut flower arrangements just for fun. It brightens the inside of the house, and I'm partial to using them this way. So I try and be respectful. If they're really attracting a lot of pollinators, I try to not cut a bunch of them back, but I do bring them inside also. And then before we finish up, I wanted to give you this example of advocating for native plants. So I mentioned that we had park on 2 sides of our property. And this is actually a map over here on the right. And that's our house up there on the upper left-hand side below that chunk of park. And when we moved in, it was basically just lawn and some trees, grass and trees. And then there was a parking lot over next to our neighbor's house, which is that other house kind of up there at the top chunk of the map. And the reason this became an issue was actually that, you know, we were having some issues with people loitering in the parking lot. And at some point our neighbors said, you know what, we should just go to the parks board and complain about the parking lot and ask them if there's anything they can do about the parking lot. And this prompted a whole discussion about like really what should happen with this park, because they didn't want to tear the parking lot out if they were thinking about putting in a ball field or some other recreational facility. But when we got this on the agenda at the parks meeting in town, it became pretty clear that this park was really kind of they kept calling it a pass-through park, or, you know, a passive park. People walk through the park, but it wasn't really a very good candidate for adding infrastructure for recreation. So we just kept showing up at the meetings, me and my neighbors, and saying, you know, what would be really neat would be to add some native plants to the park. And the head of the parks department was really excited about it. A couple of the people in the parks board kept kind of being like, well, ball field, ball, whatever. But the more we kind of kept bringing it up, the more they said, you know, I think that would be a really good idea. And we actually have some funds available from for reforestation that we could use for this. And at the same time, they approached a local landscape architect to ask him about this. And he said, oh yeah, I'd be willing to draw up these plans and I'll donate the native plant material. So we brought in people from the community that we knew were interested in basically brightening up the space. We had a little bit of work to do to convince them that native plants were a good idea. The landscape architect was kind of on the fence. You know, he probably, if it had been up to him, he might not have done it in all natives, but having a couple of us there saying, you know, we want there to be a pollinator garden, we'd like to incorporate the native species into the arboretum. It was really easy for him to do, even though it might not have been his first inclination. So my tips, if this is something that a situation that you find yourself in, or if you're interested in advocating for native plants, is to make sure you understand the process in your town, city, county for how this type of thing happens, and be really positive, right? Town government people are used to hearing people complain all the time. So if you can go in with a positive message and some suggestions for how to improve without giving them a hard time about how they're managing their park resources, they're often much more receptive. So I put that down here as, you know, trying not to be the crazy plant lady and more sort of the citizen volunteer, being willing to help. And then think creatively about donations of time and plant materials as well, as sort of my other tip there. There's our neighbor who's now a commissioner cutting this is our house actually back behind the christening of the park and such. There's some challenges with native plants in landscapes. A big one is that people may not be trained to identify native plants or perennials at different stages of emergence. So they might accidentally herbicide them or accidentally weed them. That's a pretty common occurrence, accidentally weed whack them or accidentally mow them, right? So ways to help with that: if you're competent at IDing natives, you can walk out there if you see them working and sort of show them. I've done that before when I see them out in the park, wander around and say, oh yeah, this is this one, you want that one. Or offer to weed and maintain them yourself. I know it's not a fun alternative, but sometimes that's what I wind up doing as well, is just doing a little bit of the maintenance so that they don't come in and feel the need to herbicide. That's another way to kind of be a little passive aggressive about it. Other sources of conflict with native plants, I probably don't need to tell you about these. Yeah, so my husband hates Virginia creeper. It has a lot of wildlife value, and I actually really like the way it looks. So that's a big source of conflict. The other ones I was like, which other ones are a major source of conflict? And he said, the blackberry bushes are a big source of conflict. And I have common milkweed popping up everywhere in the yard. I tried to put it in one place and it just spread everywhere. So those are a couple that are moving around. And not everybody likes and appreciates insects. So that's one to consider as well. And these are my final takeaways. Be patient, I mentioned. Be prepared to spend time and or money if you want big changes to happen. There's a little bit of a trade-off with the patience and money, but sort of a balancing act. Take the time to pay attention to the critters that show up when you plant natives. One of my favorite rituals is to finish my workday, pop a beer, and go out and wander around the yard and see what I see, and look at the undersides of leaves and look at the pollinators, or maybe make a bouquet and bring it in the house. It can be a really good way to incorporate some of those rituals and almost mindfulness and meditation into your day, just to have the plants in your yard. Purchase a couple resources that'll help you feel inspired when you're getting, stuck, or maybe all you're thinking about is weeding. Have a couple things around that help you get that sort of hopeful feeling back about plants and your property. Evangelize and tell people what you know and educate them about native plants, but try and be careful about turning people off. It can be really hard. When my mom or my stepmom tell me about a plant that they're really excited about and moving it around on their property, and I might not think it's a good idea. Sometimes I'll say something and sometimes I won't. You don't always want to rain on people's parade, but sometimes also giving people native alternatives, or, that's a really pretty plant, a native plant that would be a really good alternative for that would be this one if you're thinking about replacing it. So lots of great opportunities to share with people, but be careful as well. That's what I've got, folks. I know that I took more time than I think I had originally been given, but I'm happy to use whatever we have left for discussion or questions. And I was going to put my email on here, but it looks like it didn't show up. But we can share my email as well. It's my first name, maria.s.bowman@gmail.com, and I'll throw it in the chat. So if people have questions or follow up, they can feel free to get in touch with me as well.
Maria, that was delightful. Thank you so much for sharing that. Would you be willing to send a slide deck in the chat as well for folks so they can have those links to the various resources?
Yes, I will see if I can make it public and drop it in the chat here.
All right, well, we do have a solid 13 or so minutes here. If anyone has any questions, feel free to toss them in the chat or go ahead and unmute yourself and ask away. Robert, I think maybe you're talking, but we've got you muted there. So go ahead and unmute yourself. There it is.
All right, how about now?
Yep, you're good.
Okay. Any place you would do for native trees, planting new trees?
So purchasing trees or where to put them?
Both.
So I've done a lot of bare root tree purchases from that mid-Atlantic native. So you can choose them in different heights. I typically add them at the back of some of my borders. So this year I purchased a couple of pawpaw trees that I put along my fence. A lot of trees need pretty good sun, especially some of those native fruit trees. I have like a sassafras tree actually in my front yard that's doing really, really well. And that's a good one if you have friends that have woodlands or you're good at identifying native trees that you want. You can sometimes go and dig up a small native from a portion of your property or a woods of someone that you know and transplant it. And a lot of those trees, if they're small, they'll do okay with that as long as you're getting most of the root structure with them.
Okay.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that. I have a few folks that I know here locally that they like to go around and sort of guerrilla plant things, right? They'll go into other spaces and they'll put native plants and do some tree plantings and things like that. It's all over. Just wondering, is that something that you've ever done or like felt a desire to do as you start getting into this? Just like toss seeds places and carry them around, kind of.
Oh, I felt a desire to do it. I would say the thing that I feel a desire to do more often is pull up invasives when I'm in public places. That's one that that's impossible, right? Because if I'm going along a trail that has garlic mustard, that would be my entire hike. But that's usually the impulse I have to stifle the most. There's no good reason I haven't done it. I mean, I think in a lot of cases, seeds are dispersing naturally anyway, so why not? Yeah, I mean, the closest I've gotten to guerrilla planting was like when there kind of wasn't clear where the boundary was on our property with the park. And it used to be completely overgrown with honeysuckle bushes for a while before we had a fence in. I was just tossing seed out there to get something out there to make sure we had some coverage and there were some flowers blooming. And then I steadily kind of like brought the border back when we got the fence in and kind of turned it into more of a property boundary. But I think they were so happy that I took out the invasive species that nobody really cared whether I was 5 feet over the property boundary with some of my flowers. So.
I know we had asked everyone that registered to say what their favorite plant was, and I would love if you would to share what your favorite native was.
I'll tell Maria about 4 years ago, we planted 4 pawpaws on the edge of our woods. And I thought I would do nice and put 1 of them in the sun and 3 in the shade. The 3 in the shade are 25% taller than the ones in the sun. So
are any of them fruiting is the question.
They all fruited the second year.
Oh my gosh, that's awesome.
A bushel from each tree. We purchased them from Edible Landscaping.
I know other people that have gotten them there and have had good success. So yeah, that's a great resource. Awesome. Anybody else favorite native plants? I saw a beautyberry bush come into the chat. I have one of those in the front. I love that one too. Don't be shy. I saw some of the ones that came through email, but everybody else didn't see them.
I can go ahead and copy that into the chat if we want.
Jonathan,
Yes, Kathy.
this is Kathy. Can I? We're away from home and we're on our phone, and I don't know how to raise my hand, other than speaking out.
You're good.
Yeah, you're speaking.
Okay. I was wondering if Maria had any experience with native plants with solar ground solar panels.
So in our town, we actually have a big solar array that's out near the there's like a town facility and there's a big solar array next to it, and they have done some seeding of wildflowers. I don't think they're entirely native, but we're working on putting together sort of the specs for that, so we have a list of it. So I know that there are people that are doing that. I also know that there are people, like there's a lot of different multiple use going on with ground solar panels and grazing, for example. So I'm pretty sure you can put pretty much any wildflower meadow out there as long as you think about sort of the order of things. It's a pretty good way to get pollinator habitat together with that use.
Thanks.
Yep.
There's that massive list of all the favorites that folks share.
Oh yeah. That milkweed that I showed that I was doing some winter sowing of is actually a milkweed that's supposed to do well in the shade. So I've been trying to think about whether I can get milkweed to grow in the shade in some of my dry shade areas. So that was part of the reason I was growing that one this year. Yeah, grass.
Jonathan, I've got another comment.
Yeah, comment away, Kathy.
Okay. Unbelievably, we were at Mount Cuba Center today and spent the day there. We didn't plan it this way, but we got our camping reservations and wanted to go there. And then, we planned this with you, and it turned out to be tonight. So So I would just really encourage everybody to, plan on going to that. Yeah, Charlie's showing you the thing for it. And yeah. So anyway, it's a wonderful way to spend the day.
Awesome.
I'll
I have a question. Oh, go ahead.
No, go for
These
it.
are all, we have a spot in our house that's under an eaves on the south side. It's really dry sun. What kind of natives would you suggest for a spot like that?
So one of the things I have in dry sun that's been doing really well is wild petunia. It's kind of short and low growing. Another one that I have that does really well in dry sun, actually it's self-seeding a lot, is Aromatic Aster. It grows like 2 or 3 feet tall, so it's one of the shorter asters, but really likes that dry sun also.
Are there grasses that would work for that?
Yes. Yeah, a lot of those grasses, once they're established, you might need to water them a little bit, but like the problem with the grasses is that a lot of them are really tall also, so there's that tallness problem. So it depends a little bit on whether you're looking for something short. So little blue stem is a really good sort of moderate height one that I have a lot of in the kind of.
And that takes dry sun?
Yep.
Okay, thanks.
What about the switch grasses?
Yeah, those will do it too. Some of those get pretty tall. I know a couple of
there's Shenandoah, I think it's around 3 feet maybe.
My Shenandoah ones they just haven't established super well, but I have them in kind of a shadier area. But yeah, I think they get around 3 to 4 feet. Yep.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
I saw a bunch of people put redbud in as a favorite, and I only recently in the last few years discovered that redbud is delicious as a salad topping.
Really?
It tastes like the little buds. They taste like sugar snap peas. It's incredible.
Oh, so it's the buds, not the leaves.
Yeah. The little buds. Yeah, the little red buds.
They're all over. Now I can't try it.
Yeah, exactly. But I was wondering, Maria, if you know of any other things that are like, again, good edible flowers and things like that to like spice up a salad or, a plate of any sort.
Oh boy, that's not my forte. If my mom on, because she is always trying to find ways to eat things.
Yes, your mother.
She has a bad internet connection though.
Garlic mustard and chickweed and dandelion greens.
Dandelion greens is a good one.
That we have a lot of. Some of those, of course, are non-native, and so it's really especially gratifying to eat those.
Yeah, great ones.
Yeah, I've used purple dead nettle. I don't know if it's native or not, but I've used purple dead nettle and I've soaked it in like high proof alcohol and have made like a liqueur with it, with some sugars and stuff like that. And it's sort of a interesting thing.
Regular nettles, obviously, if folks are probably pretty familiar with those, you just have to come up with some strategies for foraging them, but delicious on pizza and stuff cooked. So good one too.
We have about a couple minutes here. I don't know if anyone has any other final questions or.
I have a question, Maria. Can you hear me?
Yep.
I just purchased Aronia bush, and I'm trying to decide where to put it. Would you have a recommendation?
So I have mine. It's in the front of the house and it gets afternoon sun. Does pretty well. I think I bought it as a mature plant, so I'm not sure how big yours is, but it took off. It's been really happy there, and I just made sure to water it really well the first few months. But part sun, part shade, they seem to do pretty well in. So usually this stuff, unless it requires full shade, which that one doesn't, it'll probably do well with a little more sun. But mine has had beautiful berries on it the last couple of years in that spot with afternoon sun. So
okay, so it only has about half a day sun.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
All right, we are at 8 o'clock. So yeah, we can go ahead and call it there. Maria she put her email in the chat. So feel free to reach out if you have other questions or didn't get a chance to ask something. But thank you all so much for joining. And Dr. Bowman, thank you so much for joining us this evening. This was really great talk, really informative. Appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Okay, thanks, folks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Maria.
Bye, Kathy.